The morning sun cast long shadows across Washington, D.C.'s busy streets as Officer James Barrett began his regular patrol. It was just another Tuesday in September, and the city was buzzing with its usual morning traffic. Barrett had been on the force for 8 years, and he took pride in keeping his beat clean and orderly. Sitting in his police cruiser, Barrett sipped his lukewarm coffee while watching the intersection of 16th Street. The morning had been quiet, just a few speeding tickets and one minor fender bender. But that was about to change. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes S-Class with dark-tinted windows caught his attention. The car was moving smoothly through traffic, but Barrett noticed something that made him sit up straighter. The Mercedes rolled through a stop sign, barely slowing down at the intersection. "Got you," Barrett muttered to himself, placing his coffee in the holder and starting his engine. He flipped on his lights and pulled out into traffic, following the Mercedes. The luxury car continued for another block before properly pulling over to the curb, parking perfectly parallel to the sidewalk. Barrett radioed in the stop to dispatch, reading out the license plate number. Following standard procedure, he adjusted his body camera and stepped out of his cruiser. The morning air was crisp, and his polished boots clicked against the pavement as he approached the vehicle. Through the tinted windows, Barrett could make out the silhouette of a single occupant in the driver's seat. He noticed the car was immaculately clean, and the paint job looked fresh. In his experience, such expensive cars in this part of town often meant trouble: drug dealers or other criminals flaunting their illegal gains. "Driver, lower all your windows," Barrett commanded, his right hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. The windows smoothly descended, revealing a well-dressed African-American man in his early 40s. The man wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit with a deep blue tie, his appearance more fitting for a corporate boardroom than a traffic stop. "Good morning, officer," the driver spoke calmly, his hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they should be. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Barrett's posture stiffened slightly. Something about the driver's composed demeanor and professional appearance didn't sit right with him. In his mind, people usually showed more nervousness during traffic stops. This man's confidence felt like a challenge. "You ran through a stop sign back there," Barrett stated, his tone becoming more assertive. "License, registration, and insurance, please." The driver nodded politely. "Of course, officer. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Slowly, Barrett warned, his hand still near his weapon. The man carefully opened the glove compartment and retrieved the documents. From his breast pocket, he pulled out a leather wallet containing his license. His movements were deliberate and smooth, making sure Barrett could see everything he was doing. "Here you go, officer," the man said, handing over the documents. "My name is Marcus Wells, and I apologize if I missed the stop sign. I'm running a bit late for an important meeting." Barrett examined the documents with scrutiny. The license and registration matched the vehicle and the driver, but something still felt off to him. The car was too nice, the man too calm, the situation too perfect. "Where are you headed in such a hurry, Mr. Wells?" Barrett asked, emphasizing the "Mr." with a slight edge in his voice. "I have a meeting downtown," Marcus replied simply, maintaining his professional tone. Barrett noticed a subtle bulge under Marcus's suit jacket, something that could be a weapon. His suspicion grew stronger, and his training kicked in. He'd seen too many cases where well-dressed criminals tried to pass themselves off as legitimate businessmen. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Barrett ordered, his voice hardening. Now. The situation was about to escalate, but neither man knew just how significantly this traffic stop would change both their lives. Marcus Wells looked at Officer Barrett for a moment, reading the growing hostility in the officer's body language. He knew what was coming. He'd been here before. Marcus Wells opened his car door slowly, his movements careful and measured. The morning traffic continued to flow past them, with some drivers slowing down to look at the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. He stepped out of his Mercedes, standing at his full height of 6 feet 2 inches, his expensive suit wrinkle-free despite the tension in the air. Officer Barrett took 2 steps back, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he commanded, watching as Marcus complied without argument. The officer's eyes narrowed at the perfect crease in Marcus's pants, the shine of his Italian leather shoes, and the subtle glint of what appeared to be a very expensive watch peeking out from under his sleeve. "Sir, I don't mean to be difficult," Marcus said calmly, "but I truly am running late for an important meeting. If you could just write me a ticket for the stop sign, I'll handle it appropriately." Barrett's jaw tightened. The man's composed attitude was getting under his skin. In his experience, people who acted this calm usually had something to hide. "Oh, you're running late?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, that's not my problem, is it? How about you explain to me how you can afford a $100,000 car?" Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible at waist level. "Officer Barrett," he said, reading the name tag on the officer's uniform, "I understand you're doing your job, but my profession and financial situation aren't relevant to a traffic violation." This response seemed to anger Barrett further. "Actually, sir, it becomes relevant when we have a history of drug trafficking in this area. Expensive cars, fancy suits, we've seen it all before." He circled around Marcus, his boots scraping against the pavement. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on here?" A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, several people pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Marcus noticed this but kept his attention focused on the officer. Years of training had taught him to stay aware of his surroundings without appearing nervous or distracted. "Officer," Marcus tried again, his voice remaining steady, "I respect your authority, but I think we're moving beyond the scope of a simple traffic stop. If you have specific concerns, I'm happy to address them, but I prefer to do so professionally." Barrett scoffed, reaching for his handcuffs. "Professional? You want to talk about professional? How about we discuss that bulge under your jacket? Slowly, and I mean slowly. Tell me what you're carrying." The crowd grew larger, and whispers began circulating. Some onlookers shook their heads, having seen this scene play out too many times before in their neighborhood. A young woman in the crowd started live-streaming the encounter on her phone. Marcus kept his composure, though a flicker of frustration crossed his face. "Officer Barrett, I'm trying to handle this situation respectfully, but you should know that." "Hands on the car," Barrett interrupted, his voice rising. "Now, spread your legs, hands on the hood." Marcus complied, placing his hands carefully on the warm hood of his Mercedes. He could have shown his CIA credentials earlier, but years of experience had taught him that sudden movements or reaching for identification too quickly could make situations like this even more dangerous. Barrett approached, roughly patting down Marcus's legs. When he reached the suit jacket, his hand touched the hard object beneath. "Aha!" he exclaimed, his suspicions seemingly confirmed. "Don't move a muscle. You're going to tell me right now what you're carrying, or things are going to get very unpleasant." The morning sun now beat down directly on them, and a bead of sweat rolled down Barrett's temple. Traffic had slowed to a crawl as more people stopped to watch. In the distance, the sound of additional sirens could be heard approaching, but they weren't the backup Barrett had called for, though he didn't know that yet. Marcus turned his head slightly, looking at Barrett with calm but tired eyes. "Officer, I'm going to say this one more time. You're making a serious mistake, and if you just allow me to slowly reach into my jacket, I can prove." "Stop talking," Barrett snapped, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and possible possession of an illegal weapon. You have the right to remain silent." As Barrett began reading Miranda rights, 3 black government SUVs turned the corner, their tires screeching against the asphalt. The next few minutes would change everything, but for now, Marcus simply closed his eyes and waited, knowing the situation was about to resolve itself in a way Officer Barrett couldn't possibly expect. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists as Officer Barrett continued reading him his rights. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 30 people, their phones raised high to capture every moment of the tense scene. The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl, creating a chorus of honking horns in the background. "I'm going to search your vehicle now," Barrett announced, his voice carrying a note of triumph. He clearly believed he was about to uncover something illegal. The 3 black SUVs were now only 2 blocks away, their engines roaring as they sped toward the scene. Marcus stood calmly beside his Mercedes, the handcuffs secure, but not uncomfortably tight. He watched as Barrett began to circle his car, peering through the windows with intense focus. In the distance, Marcus could hear the distinctive sound of government vehicles approaching. He knew he only needed to wait a few more minutes. Officer, Marcus tried one final time, keeping his voice steady. Before you proceed with the search, I strongly suggest you check with your dispatch. I believe they're trying to reach you. Barrett's radio had indeed been crackling with activity, but he had been too focused on the arrest to notice. He ignored Marcus's suggestion and reached for the driver's side door handle. Just as his fingers touched the metal, a voice boomed from his radio. Unit 247, respond immediately. This is an urgent priority message. Barrett hesitated, his hand still on the door handle. He glanced at his radio, then back at Marcus, who stood there with an expression that mixed resignation with patience. The officer's finger moved to his radio button, but before he could respond, the first black SUV rounded the corner. The government vehicle's tires screeched against the asphalt as it came to a precise stop. The second and third SUVs appeared seconds later, positioning themselves in a perfect triangle around Barrett's patrol car and Marcus's Mercedes. The crowd of onlookers stepped back, phone still recording. Officer Barrett sat in his patrol car, his hands trembling as he stared at the computer screen. Multiple urgent messages flashed across the display, all marked with high priority status from various government agencies. His collar felt too tight, and sweat dampened his uniform as the reality of his situation sank in. Outside, the scene had transformed into something that looked like a movie set. The three CIA SUVs maintained their triangular formation, while agents in suits and tactical gear secured the perimeter. News vans from local stations had parked across the street, their reporters doing live broadcasts from behind the safety line established by the CIA. Marcus Wells stood with Director Ch. The White House Situation Room buzzed with nervous energy as Marcus Wells finally walked through its heavy doors. Despite being 45 minutes late, he carried himself with the same calm dignity he'd shown during the traffic stop incident. The room fell silent as he entered, every eye turning to the man whose morning had already made national headlines. Deputy Director Wells, the President's National Security Advisor, stood to greet him. We saw what happened on the news. Are you all right to proceed with the briefing? Marcus straightened his tie and nodded. Yes, ma'am. National security doesn't wait for traffic stops gone wrong. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, breaking some of the tension. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Barrett sat alone in Captain Rodriguez's office, watching the incident replay on every major news channel. His face appeared on screen again and again, his actions dissected by news anchors and social media commentators. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from family, friends, and fellow officers. Your record shows 17 similar stops in the past month, Rodriguez said, walking in with a thick file. Expensive cars, African-American drivers, no real probable cause. Care to explain that pattern? Barrett stared at his hands, unable to find words. The morning's events kept playing in his mind, but now he saw them differently. He saw his own assumptions, his quick judgments, his refusal to listen. Back at the White House, Marcus stood before digital screens displaying satellite images and classified documents. The intelligence we gathered suggests an imminent threat to 3 major cities, he explained, his voice steady despite his delayed arrival. If I had been detained any longer, we might have missed our window for preventive action. One of the generals spoke up. So you're telling me that officers' prejudice nearly compromised national security? That's exactly what I'm saying, Marcus replied. But let's focus on the threat at hand. We can discuss police reform another time. As Marcus detailed the security situation, his phone lit up with messages. The incident had gone viral, with millions of views across social media platforms. #Soracism was trending nationwide, and civil rights leaders were already calling for interviews. In the police station, Captain Rodriguez placed another file on his desk. Barrett, do you know what this is? He asked, opening the folder. These are complaints from other African-American drivers you've stopped. We ignored them before. That stops today. Barrett's voice cracked as he finally spoke. I never thought. I didn't see myself as... As what? Rodriguez interrupted. As prejudiced. That's the problem, Barrett. None of us do, until something like this forces us to look in the mirror. The captain walked to his window, watching protesters gathering outside the station. Signs reading "End Police Racism" and "Justice for All" bobbed up and down in the morning air. You know what makes this worse? Rodriguez continued. Deputy Director Wells wasn't just any CIA agent. He was heading to a briefing about a critical national security threat. Your actions could have had consequences far beyond a simple traffic stop. At the White House, Marcus concluded his briefing. The room buzzed with activity as orders were issued and teams mobilized. As others filed out, the National Security Advisor held him back. "Marcus," she said softly, "what you experienced today, it happens too often, but you handled it with remarkable grace." Marcus smiled tiredly. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to let it expose itself. That officer didn't just learn about his own bias today, he learned that appearances never tell the whole story. As the day continued, the incident sparked discussions across the country about racial profiling, police training, and implicit bias. News channels replayed the footage, experts debated solutions, and social media exploded with commentary. In his office, Barrett watched it all unfold, finally understanding the full impact of his actions. He had not only wrongly profiled a senior government official, he had potentially jeopardized national security because of his prejudices. The truth of his actions, now exposed to the world, would force not just him but his entire department to confront uncomfortable realities about law enforcement and racial bias in America. By late afternoon, the incident had exploded across every major news network. The police station's press room was packed with reporters, their cameras focused on Captain Rodriguez as he addressed the growing controversy. "The actions of Officer Barrett do not reflect the values of our department," Rodriguez stated firmly, his voice clear despite his obvious fatigue. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into this incident and reviewing all of Officer Barrett's previous traffic stops." Outside the station, the crowd of protesters had grown to several hundred people. Their chants echoed through the streets, demanding justice and police reform. Local community leaders moved through the crowd, ensuring the protests remained peaceful while making their voices heard. Meanwhile, Barrett sat alone in his apartment, watching his world crumble on live television. His phone had finally stopped buzzing. Most of his friends and family had said their piece, some supporting him, others expressing disappointment. The TV showed clips of his confrontation with Marcus Wells playing on repeat, each viewing making him sink deeper into his couch. His doorbell rang, making him jump. When he opened it, he found his partner, Officer Sarah Chen, standing there with concern in her eyes. "You look terrible, James," she said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. "Have you eaten anything today?" Barrett shook his head, closing the door. "How can I eat? My career is over, Sarah. I'm going to be the poster boy for racist cops across America." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Sarah replied, dropping a takeout bag on his coffee table. "Maybe this is your wake-up call. I tried to tell you before that you were profiling people, but you never listened." At the CIA headquarters, Marcus Wells finished his second briefing of the day. As people filed out of the conference room, Director Chen stayed behind. "The White House is pleased with how you handled the situation," she said, sitting across from him. "But they're concerned about the media attention. This could complicate some of our ongoing operations." Marcus loosened his tie slightly. Sometimes complications are necessary for progress. That officer needed to learn a lesson, and so does his department. "Speaking of lessons," Chen smiled slightly, "the police academy has requested you as a guest speaker. They want to use this incident as a teaching moment for their cadets." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Officer Barrett's captain, requesting a private meeting. Marcus read the message twice before showing it to Chen. "What do you think?" he asked. "Should I meet with them?" Back at Barrett's apartment, Sarah was making him face hard truths. "You know what's crazy?" she said, pushing a container of food toward him. "I bet you don't even realize how many times I've seen you do this. Black driver, nice car, immediate suspicion." Barrett picked at his food. "I was just following my training, my instincts." "No," Sarah cut him off sharply. "You are following your prejudices. Real police instincts are based on actual suspicious behavior, not skin color and car prices." The evening news now showed split-screen coverage. Protesters outside the police station on one side, cybersecurity experts discussing the potential national security implications on the other. The incident had sparked a nationwide debate about the intersection of racial profiling and national security. Barrett's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Captain Rodriguez. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Deputy Director Wells will be there. Don't be late. Sarah read the message over his shoulder. This is your chance, James. Don't waste it by being defensive. Listen to what they have to say. As night fell over the city, Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the day's events. On his desk lay two items: the morning's security briefing about potential threats to American cities, and a preliminary outline for a new police training program focused on eliminating racial bias. His phone buzzed one final time, a message from his wife. Saw you on the news. You handled it with grace, as always. But please tell me this means you'll finally accept that security detail I've been asking you to take. Marcus smiled, thinking about how one traffic stop had set so many changes in motion. Tomorrow's meeting would be interesting, but tonight he had more pressing matters to attend to. The incident had shed light on long-standing issues, but it had also reminded everyone that national security and civil rights were interconnected in ways few people realized. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog covering Washington, D.C. Officer James Barrett stood outside the police station's main conference room, his civilian clothes feeling strange after years of wearing a uniform. His hands were sweaty as he checked his watch. 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early for the meeting that could determine his future. Inside the conference room, Marcus Wells was already seated with Captain Rodriguez and two other people Barrett didn't recognize. One was a woman in a sharp business suit who he would later learn was from the Police Oversight Committee, and the other was a man taking notes on a laptop. "Come in, Barrett," Rodriguez called out, noticing him through the glass door. "Take a seat." Barrett walked in, trying to keep his composure. The room felt too warm, too small. He sat down across from Marcus, finding it difficult to meet the CIA deputy director's steady gaze. "Before we begin," Marcus spoke first, his voice calm and measured. "I want to make something clear. This meeting isn't about punishment. It's about understanding and change." The woman from the Oversight Committee opened a thick folder. "Officer Barrett, we've reviewed your entire service record. 8 years on the force, over 2,000 traffic stops. Would you like to guess what percentage of those stops involved African American drivers in luxury vehicles?" Barrett felt his throat go dry. He'd never thought about the numbers before. I don't know." 78%, she said, sliding a chart across the table. "That's not random chance, Officer Barrett. That's a pattern." Marcus leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Yesterday, my delay in reaching the White House could have had serious consequences for national security. But that's not why we're here. We're here because what happened to me happens to countless others who don't have CIA credentials to protect them." Captain Rodriguez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the protesters who were still gathered outside. "The department is implementing mandatory bias training, effective immediately. But we need to do more than just check boxes, Barrett. We need real change." The man with the laptop turned his screen around, showing video clips from Barrett's body camera over the past year. Each clip showed a similar pattern: luxury cars, black drivers, aggressive questioning without cause. "Watch these," Marcus said softly. "Watch them and tell us what you see." Barrett felt sick as he watched himself on screen. Each interaction showed the same assumptions, the same immediate suspicion, the same escalation without cause. In one clip, he made a doctor in a BMW step out of his car on his way to perform emergency surgery. "I never." Barrett started, then stopped. "I didn't realize." "That's the problem," the Oversight Committee woman said. "Bias often works without our conscious awareness. But that's not an excuse, it's a call to action." Marcus pulled out his phone and played a video that had gone viral overnight. It showed the entire interaction from yesterday, but from a bystander's perspective. The comments below the video were filled with people sharing similar experiences. "Your actions yesterday didn't just affect me," Marcus explained. "They affected every person who watched that video and saw their own experiences reflected in it. They affected every officer who now has to work harder to build trust with their community." Captain Rodriguez returned to his seat. "Here's what's going to happen, Barrett. You're going to complete an extensive training program. You're going to work with community leaders. You're going to learn about the impact of bias in law enforcement. And then, only then, will we discuss your return to active duty." Barrett nodded slowly, finally understanding the full scope of his actions. "I want to learn," he said quietly. "I want to be better." Marcus stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "That's a start. because this isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It's about changing a system that allows bias to affect life or death decisions. As the meeting concluded, Barrett realized this wasn't the end of his career, it was the beginning of a different kind of service. One where he would need to confront his own prejudices and help others do the same. The fog outside was starting to lift, and with it, the fog of his own biased thinking began to clear as well. 3 months after the traffic stop incident, the police academy's largest lecture hall was filled to capacity. Officers from departments across the country sat shoulder to shoulder, their attention focused on the two men standing at the podium, Marcus Wells and James Barrett. "My name is James Barrett," Barrett began, his voice steady but humbled. "And 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed not just my life, but the way our entire department approaches policing." The room was silent as Barrett shared his story. Gone was the defensive officer from that morning 3 months ago. In his place stood a man who had spent countless hours learning, reflecting, and working to change. Marcus stood beside him, no longer in his usual suit but dressed casually in a polo shirt and slacks. Over the past months, he had worked closely with the police department to develop new training programs, using his own experience as a teaching tool. Officer Barrett's story isn't unique. Marcus addressed the crowd. What makes it different is what happened afterward. Instead of becoming defensive or bitter, he chose to learn and grow. That's why we're here today. On the screen behind them, body camera footage played from Barrett's most recent shifts. The difference was striking. His interactions with all citizens, regardless of race or vehicle type, were respectful, professional, and based on actual violations rather than assumptions. "The hardest part," Barrett continued, "wasn't admitting I was wrong. It was realizing how many lives I had impacted with my biased decisions. How many people I had humiliated or frightened simply because they didn't fit my idea of who should be driving an expensive car." In the audience, Captain Rodriguez watched with pride. The department's new training program, developed with input from Marcus and civil rights leaders, had become a model for other cities. Complaints of racial profiling had dropped significantly, and community trust was slowly being rebuilt. "Change isn't just about policies," Marcus explained, clicking to the next slide. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about understanding that the person you're pulling over might be a doctor rushing to save lives, a teacher heading to school, or yes, even a CIA deputy director on his way to a security briefing." Laughter rippled through the crowd at this last part, breaking the tension. Barrett smiled too, remembering how differently that morning could have gone if he had just listened, just looked past his assumptions. "Today, Officer Barrett, and I don't just tell this story," Marcus continued. "We demonstrate what can happen when we confront our biases head-on, when we choose to learn from our mistakes rather than defend them." The presentation shifted to statistics showing the impact of the new training program. Traffic stop data revealed a dramatic decrease in racial disparities, while public satisfaction with police interactions had improved significantly. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Barrett added. "What matters are the daily interactions, the moments when we choose to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. When we remember that every person we stop is someone's family member, someone's friend, someone who deserves respect." As the session ended, officers lined up to speak with both men. Many shared their own experiences, both as officers and as minorities who had faced profiling themselves. The conversation was open, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable, exactly what was needed for real change. Later that evening, as they packed up their materials, Marcus turned to Barrett. "Ready for tomorrow's community meeting?" Barrett nodded, straightening his tie. "Ready, though I still get nervous facing the people I might have wronged before." "That's good," Marcus smiled. "It means you care. It means you're still learning." As they walked out of the building, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Barrett noticed Marcus heading toward a familiar black Mercedes. "Still driving the same car?" Barrett asked with a slight smile. "Of course," Marcus replied, unlocking the door. "Because the problem was never about the car, Barrett. It was about who people expected to see behind the wheel." They parted ways, each heading home after another day of working to change the system from within. The incident that had threatened to end Barrett's career had instead transformed it, turning a moment of prejudice into a movement for change. As Marcus drove home, he realized that sometimes the best way to fight bias wasn't through force or shame, but through education, understanding, and the willingness to learn from our mistakes.